It started like any other morning, with the sun just peeking over the treeline and the quiet of my property settling in. I was walking down my driveway, coffee in hand, when I noticed a black SUV parked near the entrance. Its windows were tinted, but the logos on the doors made it clear. These were HOA officers. Not just any HOA officers. They carried themselves like law enforcement, badges clipped to their belts, hands hovering near their radios. I paused, confused. I had checked every record before moving in. I wasn't part of their HOA. I didn't live in their community. I didn't even pay their fees. Yet here they were, blocking my own driveway, staring at me like I'd committed some crime. "Sir," one of them called, stepping out of the vehicle with a clipboard, "we need to see your identification. You're on HOA property, and failure to comply is a violation." I blinked. "This is my property," I said, gesturing toward the land surrounding us. "I'm not part of your HOA." The officer's expression didn't change. In fact, his jaw tightened and the other officer shifted slightly, stepping closer. "Whether or not you're a member, you're still required to identify yourself on community grounds," he said. "Refusal could lead to arrest." Arrest. On my own property. For not being a member of their association. My stomach sank, but I kept my voice steady. "I don't belong to your HOA. I've verified this with the county records. You have no authority over me here." That seemed to annoy them more than anything else. The taller officer leaned in, his tone sharper. "You can't just ignore our rules. You're trespassing." I raised an eyebrow. "Trespassing? On my property?" I felt a pulse of disbelief, mixed with anger. I had spent years ensuring every boundary was correct, every deed recorded, every easement accounted for. This wasn't trespassing. This was harassment. One of them made a move toward their SUV, probably to call for backup or escalate the situation. The air felt heavy, tense, charged with authority clashing against truth. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my response. I took a deep breath, making sure to keep my hands visible. Escalating aggression wasn't going to help. Calm, clarity, and law on my side, that was my advantage. "You're on my land. You have no legal right to demand identification from me," I said firmly. "I suggest you step back and verify the property records before making threats." The shorter officer gritted his teeth, muttering something under his breath, while the taller one straightened, hand still near his belt. Their posture was tense, but not confident. I could sense hesitation beneath the surface. The certainty they carried a moment ago was wavering. I reached into my jacket, not for a weapon, but for the legal documents I had prepared. Surveys, deeds, tax statements, all the proof that every square foot of this property belonged to me. If authority was about evidence, they were about to learn the difference between appearance and legality. What had started as an ordinary morning had suddenly become a test of power, entitlement, and truth. The HOA officers believed they controlled the narrative. But on my land, with my deeds in hand, the rules were clear. And this was only the beginning. After the initial confrontation, I knew patience would be my greatest weapon. The HOA officers had shown their hand. They believed authority came from uniforms and intimidation, not law. I didn't respond with anger or threats. I responded with preparation. Over the next few days, I gathered every document related to my property: surveys, deeds, tax records, even old correspondence from the county confirming boundaries. Every piece of paper was a brick in the wall that would protect me from their audacity. I also documented everything. Photos of the officers at my driveway, videos of their vehicles, recordings of their statements, even timestamps of when they arrived and left. Each interaction was carefully logged. My attorney advised me that a clear, chronological record would not only protect me, but also demonstrate the sheer recklessness of their actions. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't slow down. They continued sending notices to my property, claiming I was in violation of community rules, demanding I register as a resident, or face further action. Some letters were typed, others hand-signed by the board president. Each notice grew more aggressive than the last, claiming fines and penalties for actions that never applied to me in the first place. One morning, as I reviewed a stack of notices, I noticed an SUV circling the driveway again. The same officers, same badges, same air of misplaced authority. They parked briefly and made a show of observing my property, presumably trying to intimidate me. I stepped outside calmly, documents in hand, and waved. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them aggressively. I simply made it clear I was aware of their presence, that I had proof, and that I was fully prepared to escalate matters legally if necessary. The HOA seemed frustrated by my calm demeanor. They thrived on compliance and fear. Without it, their power waned. Their attempts at authority now felt clumsy, desperate. I could see the tension in their movements, the way they glanced at one another as if seeking reassurance, searching for the confidence I refused to give them. I decided to escalate strategically. My attorney drafted a formal letter addressed to the HOA board, citing property ownership, legal boundaries, and the invalidity of their actions on my land. The tone was polite, factual, and unwavering. No threats, no dramatic language, just undeniable reality laid bare. I sent it certified, ensuring delivery and accountability. Their response came predictably, dismissive, defensive, and full of false claims. They accused me of harassment and claimed the letters were standard procedure. They refused to acknowledge that I was the legal owner. They doubled down on their false narrative, assuming time and persistence would eventually wear me down. But I had learned their methods. I knew patience and evidence were more powerful than authority without legitimacy. Residents of the neighborhood began noticing the tension. Some quietly asked questions, unsure why the HOA officers were confronting me on property I legally owned. Others whispered about the growing uncertainty within the board. Fear, after all, is contagious, and their confidence was faltering. By the end of the week, the HOA officers had left the property, muttering under their breath, no doubt returning to the board to report their failure to intimidate. But this confrontation had only revealed how fragile their control really was. They had assumed dominance over land they didn't own, relying on the illusion of authority. And now that illusion was cracking. It was becoming clear. The HOA had no idea how this story would end. The next escalation came quietly but effectively. My attorney drafted a formal notice to the HOA board, stating my ownership of the property and demanding an immediate cessation of all enforcement actions. Certified copies went to the county office and the local registrar to ensure an official record existed. Suddenly, what had seemed like a personal dispute turned into an undeniable legal matter. For the first time, the HOA was no longer acting behind the assumption of authority. They now faced documented evidence that contradicted their actions. Within days, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting, trying to maintain control of the narrative. Emails went out to residents claiming that there had been a misunderstanding regarding property boundaries. They assured homeowners that everything was under control, emphasizing stability and continuity, hoping to prevent panic. But when I attended the meeting quietly, documents in hand, the room changed instantly. I didn't raise my voice or accuse anyone. I simply presented the evidence, the surveys, the deeds, and the county confirmations. The room went silent. Board members' confident postures crumpled as homeowners began to realize that the authority they had trusted for years might have been a facade. Whispers traveled across the room, eyes darting between me and the leaders they had assumed were in charge. The board president tried to regain control, calling the meeting out of order, attempting procedural maneuvers to silence me. I ignored them. I knew the facts spoke louder than any procedural argument. When residents saw the legal documents, they began to understand the reality. The HOA had no legitimate claim to enforce rules on land I owned. Some homeowners were shocked. Others were angry, mostly at the board for keeping them in the dark. That evening, the HOA's lawyer contacted my attorney. The tone was markedly different from before. They weren't dismissive, they were negotiating. They asked questions about timelines, potential easements, and legal resolutions. The facade of authority had cracked, leaving only uncertainty. Finally, the HOA's board realized they had to treat the situation seriously. Residents, emboldened by clarity, began reaching out directly to me. Some were fearful, worried about fines and penalties they had paid for years. Others were curious, wanting to understand the scope of ownership and boundaries. I reassured them that I was not there to displace anyone or to create conflict. My goal was simple: correct the assumptions, establish boundaries, and ensure authority aligned with the law. The county paused all HOA enforcement actions while they reviewed the property claims. Utility companies requested verification of easements and road access. The same systems that had allowed the HOA to operate unchecked were now paused, questioning the legitimacy of every rule, every fine, every threat that had been issued over the years. By the end of the week, the HOA's previously unquestioned control had become unstable. Residents began consulting independent counsel. Board members whispered among themselves, realizing the consequences of decades of assumed authority. For the first time, the power dynamics had reversed. The HOA had built its authority on assumption and intimidation, and now that assumption had been shattered by evidence, patience, and clarity. What had started as a simple confrontation at my driveway had transformed into a full-scale reality check for an entire community. The HOA had no idea the truth would arrive quietly, methodically, and with consequences they could no longer ignore. Once the reality of ownership was undeniable, the HOA's control began to crumble in subtle but unmistakable ways. What had once been unquestioned authority now faced constant scrutiny. Homeowners began requesting documentation from the board, records of easements, approvals, and property rights that had never been properly verified. The board struggled to respond. Their usual confidence was gone, replaced by hurried whispers and defensive explanations that satisfied no one. The board tried to regain control through damage limitation. They scheduled private meetings, sent emails emphasizing stability, and promised transparency. But transparency was exactly what they had avoided for years, and now they couldn't hide from it. The longer they delayed, the more residents realized the HOA had operated for decades without a legitimate claim to the land they lived on. Confusion turned to anger, and anger spread like wildfire. County officials, having reviewed my filings and legal notices, confirmed what I already knew: the HOA's enforcement actions on my property were invalid. All fines and threats issued against me and any other residents acting on this land were effectively nullified. What had once been a facade of authority was now legally void, and the board's attempts to maintain power became increasingly desperate. The HOA's leadership began resigning quietly one by one. Each resignation came with vague explanations, unforeseen circumstances, personal reasons, but the underlying truth was clear: they could no longer operate under the illusion of control. Remaining board members scrambled to revise bylaws, limit their jurisdiction, and negotiate legal agreements to stabilize the neighborhood without admitting full responsibility. Homeowners, now aware of the true situation, began organizing independently. Town hall meetings replaced board meetings. Residents shared documents, compared experiences, and demanded accountability. Rules that had been enforced without legal basis were questioned and ultimately overturned. The balance of power had shifted completely, and it was now grounded in evidence rather than intimidation. Meanwhile, I remained calm. I didn't need to enforce dominance or prove a point with theatrics. My goal was correction, not chaos. Easements and access rights were negotiated transparently. Every agreement was documented. Every boundary respected. My property had finally become what it was meant to be: legally recognized, respected, and undisturbed. The contrast between the past and the present was stark. Where once the HOA operated on assumption, now every action was grounded in law. Where once fear dictated behavior, now clarity guided it. Residents who had once followed rules blindly began asking questions, learning how entitlement had misled them, and embracing a community governed by fact rather than fiction. The board's remaining members, humbled and cautious, had little choice but to comply. Authority without legitimacy cannot endure scrutiny, and their tenure had been defined by the illusion of control. That illusion, once shattered, left only accountability and procedural correctness. From my perspective, the most remarkable part was watching a system built on misplaced power transform without violence or confrontation. Patience, truth, and evidence had done what threats and intimidation never could. The HOA officers and leaders had assumed authority, but in the end, it was clarity and law that determined the outcome. What they once believed to be untouchable power had been undone quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably. With the dust settling, the HOA had transformed into something unrecognizable compared to what it once was. The board was smaller, its authority carefully defined, and its power no longer based on intimidation or assumptions. Formal agreements were finally signed, easements clearly established, access rights properly documented, and responsibilities outlined in ways that could withstand legal scrutiny. The land remained mine, the homes remained theirs, and the community began operating on a foundation of fact rather than false confidence. Homeowners were informed of the full situation, without sugarcoating or vague language. They learned the truth. Fines had been issued without basis, rules had been enforced on land that legally wasn't under HOA control, and years of assumed authority had been challenged and corrected. Many residents were shocked or frustrated, some even embarrassed by the trust they had placed in the board. But the overarching feeling was relief. Clarity replaced confusion, and legitimacy replaced intimidation. The HOA itself underwent a dramatic cultural shift. New bylaws were implemented, strictly limiting the scope of the association's authority to what they legitimately controlled. Enforcement actions could no longer be based on assumption. Every decision was documented, transparent, and accountable. The neighborhood's tone shifted immediately. Homeowners no longer felt coerced or uncertain. Instead, the focus became community management rather than arbitrary power. For me, the property had finally become what it should have been: respected, secure, and peaceful. I didn't need to impose gates, cameras, or restrictions out of spite. Ownership itself provided the protection. Boundaries were clear, authority was factual, and the land's use was guided by law, not fear. That clarity was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. Looking back, I realized that the confrontation with the HOA wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about accountability. Decades of misplaced authority had created a fragile system, and the truth, once introduced, inevitably corrected it. They had relied on fear, assumption, and obedience to maintain control, but facts do not bend to confidence, and entitlement cannot withstand reality. Now, the neighborhood thrives under clarity, not coercion. Children play, residents go about their lives, and the HOA functions only within its legitimate scope. The tension that once dominated the property is gone, replaced by understanding, transparency, and proper management. When people ask what I did first upon realizing the HOA was overstepping, they expect a story of confrontation or revenge. The truth is simpler: patience, preparation, and documentation. I let facts do the heavy lifting. By the time the HOA realized the truth, it was too late. They had no choice but to comply. They had assumed power without legitimacy. They had threatened, intimidated, and issued false fines. But in the end, truth and law prevailed. They never saw it coming. And that is why the property remains mine, the community remains peaceful, and entitlement no longer dictates the rules. The lesson is clear. Authority built on assumption is fragile, but accountability, evidence, and patience are unshakable. Once the truth arrives, it cannot be ignored.